Welcome everyone. Now I am going to discuss the contribution made by Erikson based on social development. He has given a particular development theory came to be known as Erikson theory of psychosocial development. Erikson was a development psychologist, belongs to the category of psychoanalytical schools of thought, but he differs greatly from his master Sigmund Freud regarding the concept of psychosexual development. According to Erikson, development takes place by means of interaction with the society. That is why the theory came to be known as psychosocial development theory. Psychosocial development theory of Erikson. Psychosocial development. Psychosocial development. Then what do you mean by the concept of social development? What do you mean by the concept of social development? According to Elizabeth Hurlock, the term social development implies attaining maturity in social setting. Attaining maturity in social setting is known as social development. Please note, Erikson has given a comprehensive lifespan theory of social development. The theory came to be known as psychosocial development because he has given importance to the concept of social aspect. That is why the theory came to be known as psychosocial development. And that particular theory is divided into 8 subordinate developmental stages. Erikson theory is divided into 8 subordinate development stages. And what was the major postulation given by Erikson based on his concept of psychosocial development? According to Erikson, each individual faces a developmental crisis. Please note, each individual faces a developmental crisis. That means a conflict between positive alternative and a potentially unhealthy alternative. Conflict between positive alternative and a potentially unhealthy alternative is known as developmental crisis. Developmental crisis. Please note, each individual faces a developmental crisis. The term developmental crisis implies conflict between positive alternative, one positive alternative, and a potentially unhealthy alternative. Potentially unhealthy alternative is known as developmental crisis according to Erikson. Each individual faces a developmental crisis. The term developmental crisis implies conflict between positive alternative and a potentially unhealthy alternative. Erikson has given a comprehensive lifespan developmental theory. The theory is divided into 8 distinctive developmental stages. Number one, please note, trust versus mistrust. Number one, trust versus mistrust. Then number two, autonomy versus shame and doubt. The second category is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And the third one, initiative versus guilt. And the fourth one, initiative versus guilt. Then industry versus inferiority. Industry versus inferiority. And the fifth one, identity versus role confusion. Identity versus role confusion. And the sixth one, intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation. Then the next one, that seventh one, generativity versus stagnation. Generativity versus stagnation. And the last one, ego identity versus despair. So these are the developmental stages given by Erikson. I would like to repeat. The first stage is trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, ego identity versus despair. Ego identity versus despair. So look at these developmental stages. The first one, trust versus mistrust. That means birth to 18 months. Birth to 18 months. Trust versus mistrust. The second one, 18 months to 3 years. The second stage is known as autonomy versus shame and doubt, starting from 18 months and continues up to 3 years. And the third one, initiative versus guilt, 3 years up to 6 years. That means the stage of preschools, initiative versus guilt. And the fourth one, industry versus inferiority, starting from 6 years onwards, continues up to 12 years. Then the fifth one, identity versus role confusion. Identity versus role confusion. 12 years of age and continues up to 20. That means the stage of adolescence. Identity versus role confusion. Then intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation, starting from 20 years and continues up to 45 years. Intimacy versus isolation. Then generativity stagnation. Generativity versus stagnation, 45 to 65 years. And the last one, ego identity. The last stages of psychosocial development, ego identity versus despair, starting from 65 years up to death. So these are the stages of psychosocial development. Trust versus mistrust, 0 from 18 months. Then autonomy versus shame and doubt, 18 months up to 3 years. Initiative versus guilt, 3 years up to 6 years. Industry versus inferiority, 6 years up to 12 years. Identity versus role confusion, 12 up to 20 years of age. Then intimacy versus isolation, 20 years of age up to 45 years. Then generativity versus stagnation, 45 to 65 years. And the last one, ego identity versus despair, 65 years of age up to death. So this is what is known as psychosocial developmental stages. Psychosocial developmental stages.